I know it's hard to stay awake at the end of a long day, but I would encourage you to be alert because, as my sister says, the country needs more alerts. But if you are alert, you'll know that I had sanctions installment number 1. And ingeniously, I'm titling this one Sanctions Installment 2. In that particular discourse, we looked at the sanctions under the law, social sanctions, and religious sanctions. I'm going to talk now about economic sanctions. They can come under several headings: boycotts, blockades, embargoes, and expropriation. Interestingly, a boycott is named after William Boycott, who lived in the 1800s in Ireland. When Ireland was ruled by the British, the Irish Land League sought to get fair dealings for the tenants of the farms who could not, under those terms at that time, own their own land. And in order to punish this boycott, who refused to let them own their own land, they downed tools and they refused to work for him. That's how we have come by the word boycott. It can be called a blockade, an embargo, an expropriation. I'll give you a few examples of each one. The Boston Tea Party, you'll all know that one. That was when the Americans threw the tea over into the salty water, and they've been drinking that way ever since. The Royal Navy boarding American ships in the 1800s. What happened was the slave trade was abolished in Britain in 1807, but the actual abolition of slavery did not occur until 1833. It was abolished in France in 1833, during the Revolution, but Napoleon revived it a few years later. One interesting example of a boycott is that of the Manchester dock workers, the stevedores, the longshoremen of the day, who refused to unload bales of cotton that were coming into Manchester because they objected to the slavery that was being practiced. Now, this was 1862 during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was so impressed by this that in 1863, he wrote a letter to them, commending them for their stand. The statue of Lincoln, which is now in Manchester, in a place called Lincoln Square, commemorates that relationship between Abraham Lincoln and the Manchester dock workers. Now, Brother Adam and Brother Scale referred this afternoon on 2 instances to Russia and to Britain. Well, today it's Russia everywhere, and I'm going to talk about Russia, and I'm going to talk about Britain. On the economic side of sanctions, I owe a great debt to a book called The Economic Weapon, written by Nicholas Mulder, Yale University Press, 2022. I'm going to quote some paragraphs from the book. Quoting now. The original impulse for a system of economic sanctions came at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference from the British delegate, Lord Robert Cecil, and his French counterpart, Léon Bourgeois. Now, I should mention that at this time in history, before the First World War started, Britain had already built a very large chain of telegraph systems. The oceans and the land were wired, sort of an old-fashioned internet. And using this system, the British had communication across wires. They could keep track of who was doing what. They could track prices. They had influence from one country to another and determine, because they were the great trading nation of the period, as well as being an empire, and they were able to, prior to the First World War, prepare themselves with a war against Germany by putting sanctions upon Germany, hindering their trade, blockading their vessels in port, especially the submarines, and generally protecting their interests and recruiting other countries in order to keep Germany from taking advantage of the war. This was especially difficult when the Russian Revolution occurred in 1917. Once that happened, Germany had its eye on the resources of Russia, and it made it very difficult for the Russians, who had been allies, now to sort out their own social problems while the war was going on. To continue quoting, William Arnold Foster, a British blockade administrator and ardent internationalist, worried that the, quotation, the economic weapon is one which is so infernally convenient to use that it naturally commends itself to those who sit in offices. Pens seem so much cleaner instruments than bayonets, and can be handled by the amateur with so much less exertion, so much less realization of the consequences. He admitted that during the Great War, the First World War, we tried, just as the Germans tried, to make our enemies unwilling that their children should be born. And notice the rest of this paragraph. We tried to bring about such a state of destitution that those children, if born at all, should be born dead. The early 20th century world was caught in a transition between hegemons. On the one hand, the fading imperial power of Britain, and on the other, an ascendant but immature United States, which shirked responsibility for a leadership role commensurate to its economic size. I should point out that the pound sterling was a reserve currency for the world. It was London where most of the financial transactions occurred. And it was London that set the price of the currencies that people used, the reserve currencies and so on. The United States began to catch up with Britain. By the time of the First World War, America was already a large economic power. So we had two hegemons on the scene at the same time. But I mentioned this before, that we lived then and we live now in a period of these kings. The kings mentioned by Daniel, the days of these kings. And for most of Earth's history, the world has been ruled by empires of one kind or another. America may be the last empire. Britain was the one that preceded it. And Britain ceased to be an empire, probably and particularly around the time that Israel became a nation. Certainly by 1945, 1948, and it's been in decline ever since. Returning to the quotation, the danger of this interregnum, that is between the British and the Americans, became apparent during the Great Depression, when the international economic order entered a deep crisis marked by nationalism and disintegration. Hegemony theorists emphasize that it was only in the wake of the Second World War that the United States came to provide a stable international monetary and financial system, the Bretton Woods system, enabling an embedded liberalism of national welfare states. That's the end of the quotation. The Bretton Woods system occurred in July 1944. This was after D-Day. And by then, the Allies, the Russians, the British, the Americans, the Canadians, Australians, New Zealand, the Commonwealth countries, were already pretty sure that they had the victory over the Germans. The Bretton Woods system brought a new financial order, and it essentially relegated the pound sterling to a secondary role to that of the United States dollar. This is an important point. Now, the present conflict between Russia and Ukraine, ostensibly, is, you understand, really a war between the United States and Russia. It is a war that's conducted by proxy. Interestingly enough, it's in the same area of the world, the same geography, in which the great game was played between the British and the Russians in the end of the 1800s. So we're going back to territory that is not unfamiliar to those who have labored in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on. So we're staying in more or less the same familiar routine, rehearsing, again, some of the same conflicts between the same players, but this, in a way, is different. The war is between the United States and Russia, supported by what I would call the acolytes, or the spit little economies. That is, those who are servile flatterers, because essentially the United States, which is NATO, has accreted around itself smaller countries like the European Union and others attached to the European Union through NATO, including the British themselves, who essentially have surrendered their own sovereignty to the extent that they now prefer to follow the United States. That's why I say the United States is really in charge of this war between the two countries. Now, the United States and Europe between them have levied 6,000 economic sanctions against Russia. These include removing Russia from the SWIFT financial system, making it very difficult to trade in dollars, undermining the central bank of Russia, and encouraging other countries in Europe and some outside Europe to also blockade or sanction Russia so that it doesn't prosper. Now, the odd thing about this is that the intention was to sink the Russian economy, and it doesn't seem to have done that. The ruble in the last three weeks has strengthened. It's stronger than it was before, and Russia is stronger than it was before, and it has more money than it had before, partly because of the sanctions that were put upon it. So the sanctions have actually encouraged the rise of oil and natural gas, particularly. And although the United States and Britain and some of the European countries were already in difficulty in 2021, this situation for them threatens to become worse. So that's why there is so much angst about the fact that the European Union and the countries within the European Union and some outside the European Union, all NATO members, may have difficulty heating their homes or running their industry. There is a danger in this situation of the de-dollarization of the world, which essentially means that the US dollar will cease to be the reserve currency and the dominant trading currency of the world. So these are things that we can worry about if we wish. What bothers me, brethren, is the very little effort being made to encourage the peace between these two countries. So many Ukrainians are being killed by the many thousands, by the millions, having to move from their country to Poland and to Germany in order to protect their families. But no one, not even including those who report on this conflict, seem to be particularly interested in bringing it to a close. This is a very serious lapse. It seems to me that as Christians, we have a responsibility to be peacemakers. And of course, we cannot take sides in a conflict like this, but it affects everyone. It affects the Poles. It affects those in the Balkan area. It affects everyone who looks at the world and would like to see peace. Indeed, we ought to be praying for peace. We ought to pray for the peace in Ukraine. The difficulty is that we know that this world probably will have to go out in a blaze of glory. If we understand the time of trouble correctly, then this sort of war, with its geopolitical implications, which, make no mistake about it, are worldwide, it will affect the entire world, and it will change the entire world in our lifetime. Bear in mind that we have to expect that in the days of these kings, which we're living in, that trouble is going to ascend and get worse. Now, no one can make any predictions as to what we can expect to come. The sanctions that the Europeans have put on themselves are actually a self-inflicted wound. Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, said to them, Yellen, I suppose Yellen was yelling, don't do this, because if you do this, you'll only hurt yourself. And this is what has turned out. Economic ruin, inflation or stagflation, the rise of interest rates, which will hit people in the United States and in Europe with heavy mortgages, deindustrialization, possibly famine, simply because, as you know, Russia is the largest exporter of wheat, along with Ukraine. And these are two countries vital to feeding the rest of the world. Fertilizer from Russia, so that in Britain, it's very difficult now to get fertilizer to put on the farms. Olive oil and various oils cannot be found on the supermarket shelves. There will be rationing. And of course, oil, the price of which will go up, and then natural gas and energy insecurity. Now, this is a litany of things that could happen and are indeed happening now. As I said, that we're not in a position as Christians to take sides, but what can we do? We can't pray that God will not permit these things to happen. It isn't our place to do that, because we know that it must be. The way things look right now is that Russia will most likely win this war unless something even more dangerous happens. Now, we know that the United States and the Allies are sending weaponry into Ukraine over the border. A lot of it promptly gets blown up by the Russians. With two dangers here. For Russia, which is a proud country, the transgression by NATO onto its front lawn is seen as an existential matter. Now, the United States sees defeat as existential. The United States will not brook defeat. It will not brook being in second place. The danger is that as Russia presses through Ukraine and as the West pumps more weaponry in, that somebody is going to lose, and neither of those sides, Russia or the United States, intends to lose. This is where the great danger comes in. We know from Matthew 24, in which our Lord says that the time will come that there will be a time of trouble such as there never was. And he says the time will come when no flesh could be saved, except for the intervention of the elect, the very elect. This is one scripture that I think addresses the period of time in which we're now living. I'm not saying there's going to be a nuclear war. Who can say that? But we have to be aware that these two countries, armed to the teeth with thousands of nuclear weapons, neither one of them is going to give in. And therefore, we need to keep a sense of calm and of peace. I was going to say perspective, but getting a perspective on this problem is very difficult because we're all observers. None of us can control what's going on. And it seems that the leaders who are involved in this are determined to fight to the end. The United States is going to fight to the end. Now, depending on what happens, we may be heading for a massive world-shaking catastrophe, or things might settle down a little bit. And if they settle down a little bit, that's also a problem because it puts off yet again the final end. That we don't pray for destruction of anybody. We don't pray for people to be mutilated and destroyed. But we have to accept the fact that we must go through this passage. And are we going to put this off yet again? We also have to look carefully at China. Now, the thing that interests me, brethren, is that the European world and the world of America is essentially a conglomeration of what was called Christendom. This includes Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church was part of Christendom. In some senses, part of Babylon. China does not fit this role. China has never been a Christian country. And it may be that China is going to be a point of leverage or change in ways that we don't understand. I doubt that China is going to become an empire in the way that the British were and that the Americans are. But let us think about these things, pray about it, certainly pray for Ukraine, and pray for all those who are distressed and dispossessed of their life, their home, their liberty, their family in this present crisis. We're in the days of these kings. Keep an eye on the US, keep an eye on China, because something is going to happen in this regard. We may not know what it is, but it's going to be worth watching, and it may or may not bring us closer to the haven of rest for which we all pray. God bless us all.